This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with corporate board member and the NYSE Governance Services, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. And we're going to look at a very interesting topic today, in fact, an emotional topic about withholding votes for corporate directors. Are you at risk? And joining me is sort of an expert in that field, and it's my pleasure to welcome Glen Schleyer, who's the partner with Sullivan and Cromwell. And just to give a little background, the prestigious law firm that works a lot with boards and corporate governance and M&A. Glen and his colleague Roger Cohen were the Burton Award for Legal Achievement recipients as among the best law firm writers of 2013, and it related to an article that you guys did called Shareholders versus Director Control Over Social Policy Matters, Conflicting Trends in Corporate Governance. Long title, but right. I assume it's sort of the debate that's been going on, and you guys tried to make some sense of it.
It is, and it's actually, thanks for having me, and thank you for mentioning it. It actually ties in with what we're talking about today, which is, what should the boards be thinking about, and what should shareholders be thinking about? We've seen a trend after Sarbanes-Oxley. You see more of it in Dodd-Frank, of empowering a strong independent board of directors, but then conflicting with that is greater shareholder control and a greater shareholder voice, not just over governance, but over social policy matters and things like that. So there are really interesting questions about who does what within the corporation and how should that balance of power be struck.
Well, we could take a whole show on the social policy stuff, but we're going to try and narrow in on the withhold thing because, again, it's such an emotional issue. Glen, let's first start talking a little bit about how we got to this point of the withhold votes. It obviously is something that's fairly new in the process, at least in the way it's exercised today. It might have been available in the past, but nobody quite had the tools, I think, to really make it anything meaningful. So talk a little bit about what takes us up to today, why that is relevant.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You're right that there are a number of threads that have come together in recent years to really put more of a focus on director withhold votes and the outcome of even uncontested director elections, which may have been more of a non-event in the past. And we go into all this in a lot of detail. Sullivan and Cromwell just put out recently our 2013 year-end proxy season review, and one of the focuses is breaking down director withhold votes and looking at the results and looking at what lessons can be learned. In terms of what led us to this, I think I would identify four things. One, at a basic level, is the trend over the past decade toward declassifying the board. It used to be the case that at most companies, even most large companies, each director was up every 3 years. Now, at most S&P 500 companies and an increasing number of small companies, every director is up every year. So that really provides an opportunity on an annual basis for really a perennial shareholder referendum on each director, and gives an opportunity for shareholders to use that as a vehicle for expressing displeasure about board performance or board structure or whatever it is. It also, as a practical matter, puts a huge burden on institutional investors to come up with decisions on all of these votes. There are more, 10, 12 directors at every company. As a practical matter, it can only increase reliance on proxy advisory firms just from a bandwidth perspective, from being able to make a judgment about each of these directors that are up for a vote. So that's the first one, is just each director being up each year at more companies. The second I would point to is majority voting, also a trend over the past 10 years. It used to be the case 10 years ago that a withhold vote was, maybe more of a throwaway protest vote. It still is a protest vote. It still is sending a message. But now that more companies have bylaws such that directors are not elected if they get more against votes than for votes, it also gives a real practical legal effect to it. In a sense, gives teeth to these vote no or withhold vote campaigns, because they'll have a practical effect on the company. Generally, for an incumbent director, they would have to, under company policy, submit a resignation, and then the company is in the position of making a judgment on that and publicly explaining the position. Tied in with that is the third reason, which is in 2009, the New York Stock Exchange changed their rules to prevent brokers from voting uninstructed shares of beneficial owners on uncontested elections, and that was actually codified in Dodd-Frank. So that really removed from the voting pool a large number of shares that in many cases were management friendly. It depended on the broker's specific policies. But it took those out of the mix in terms of, for a company with majority voting, looking at the for and against, and really increased the influence of the shareholders who are focused and are going out and voting, which at many companies is skewed toward the activists. The last thing I'll mention is a little more ephemeral, a little harder to quantify or point to a specific rule. I think across the board we've seen in the past couple of years a much more organized, more aggressive, and savvier shareholder activist base, especially among smaller shareholders. We see a lot more smaller shareholders distributing materials, speaking out against directors through the broker network, going directly through Broadridge and disseminating, soliciting materials against the company, actually using formerly kind of arcane Edgar forms to actually post materials on the company's own website, really being a lot smarter and more organized about getting their message out there in a broad way, even small shareholders in an uncontested election, which has really required companies in turn to become smarter about getting their own message out and continuing the trend of shareholder engagement that we've seen.
Well, in your white paper that you produced on the proxy information, you have in there the votes, the withhold votes, and when you look at the raw numbers, the numbers look a little daunting. I mean, it looks sort of large, but then when you break it down, which you guys have in the article, you see that particularly in the S&P 500, it's more of an emotional factor than it is a statistical factor. Talk a little bit about those numbers and what you think they mean.
I think that's right, and when we did, we took a look at the director withhold recommendations. What we did is focused on ISS as a fairly influential proxy advisory firm, focused on their negative recommendations on directors at companies broadly and at large cap companies, and tried to figure out why were they recommending against, what were the most common reasons, and what was the shareholder response to this. You're right, the raw numbers are high. There are a total of over 3,000 negative recommendations, which is, though when you look at it, is only about 10% of the directors who are up for election. And this is also a trend we've seen in other areas, say on pay. We see the larger companies, the S&P 500 companies, doing much better in this regard, presumably because they've been spending more time and effort focusing on it and anticipating these issues. Only about 3% of directors at S&P 500 companies receive negative recommendations, and really only out of all the thousands of director elections at S&P 500 companies in 2013, only like 9 or 10 directors received less than 50% support. So you're right. Statistically, the outcome of triggering a more against than for is not all that common. I mean, one caveat in particular on that is that doesn't mean that for directors and companies that have been through getting negative recommendations and going through in particular, if there's really an aggressive withhold vote or vote no campaign, even if you come out of that with 60, 70, 80% support, it's still, a harrowing experience, and it still can be a really bruising experience for a director in particular an outside director, in an oversight role, to really have their personal qualifications and their service on other boards, other things they're doing, their experience, being debated in this sort of public format, even if you come out more than 50%.
Well, some of it they can't take personally because there's, as we'll talk about in a minute, but you had mentioned ISS, and I was going to ask you this a little later, but I'm going to ask you this now. You can't get around ISS. It's discussed in every venue and every piece of education that we're sort of involved in. But I assume that has a big impact on the withhold vote, and particularly the percentage.
It does, yeah. It'll, when you looked at the overall numbers, if ISS recommended in favor of a director, the average vote result was like 96%. In the cases where they voted against the director, the average vote result was like 85% or so. It's hard to know what's correlation and what's causation there. There's some of both, I'm sure. The one thing to note in this area and across the board, and it goes for ISS, it goes for Glass Lewis, it goes for the voting policies of particular institutional investors, increasingly companies are realizing that's not the end, that's not the beginning or the end of the story, that recommendation. There's work to be done and education to be done to try to understand the policies and make sure that your shareholder base understands the company's position so that recommendation has less of an impact. And then, as we've seen, even after that recommendation comes out, companies have continued to respond to it, to put out supplemental proxy materials, and to rely on the engagement that they've done with shareholders to, as appropriate, convince shareholders not to follow it. The other thing which we can talk about is, I gave those general statistics of 85% average, for if ISS recommends against. What we found is that it really, really strongly matters as to why they recommended against. There are some ISS recommendations that shareholders seem to shrug off. There are some that they really seem to take to heart.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to the meat of this, and there's two things that we want to talk about. Number one, what are the top categories that a director can get or directors are getting withhold votes on, and then recommendations that you might have for what boards can do to not be as much of a target. But let's first talk about the top categories, because that was in your article as well. So educate our audience on what are the most focused on areas of concern.
Sure. Yeah, and we broke down of all these recommendations based on information that ISS provided, broke down the reasons why they got negative recommendations. We both wanted to see what were the most common and also what were the most impactful in terms of driving negative shareholder votes. And what we found is that those two don't correlate really very much at all. In fact, the most common reason that ISS, kind of by far the most common reason that ISS would recommend against a director is for independence issues. They think that the director is on a key committee, so presumably an outside director that the company has deemed to be independent. But ISS, under their more stringent definition, they deem them to be an affiliated outside director. And if you have one of those directors on a key committee, or you don't have a majority of independent directors under the ISS definition, then they're going to recommend against those directors or the inside directors. And we found that, and that's by far the most common. I think our common experience is that's the most common. In some cases, ISS has very low thresholds. Like if the director is affiliated with a company that provides professional services to the registrant, they'll consider the director to be non-independent if there's more than $10,000 in fees received, which that would be far below anything that under the stock exchange bright line rules for most director independence standards or many shareholder independence guidelines that many others would think would trigger a problem. What we found is that in those circumstances, of the directors who got negative recommendations for those reasons, no directors got less than 50% support, and the average level of support for directors in those categories is around 90%. So that's, it's something to think about, and I think in our experience, companies do think about the definitions of proxy advisory firms and the definitions of independence from their key shareholders when making their independence judgments. but it shows that it's very unlikely to drive a significant drop in most circumstances in levels of shareholder support. Shareholders don't seem to necessarily buy into those definitions of independence. On the flip side, the one that we found was less common, but the most impactful, was where ISS has determined that the board has not been responsive to shareholder concerns. Typically, they have not implemented a shareholder proposal that shareholders supported in a prior year. And in those cases, directors in those situations, a significant number of them receive less than majority support, and the average voting results were around 60%. So that's something where shareholders, and again, it's hard to know what's causation and what's correlation, but that's a situation where shareholders more broadly, and each company's shareholder base will be different, they seem to buy into that point, that if there's a shareholder proposal that is passed, that the company is expected to do something about it, or to explain to shareholders, why they're not doing something about it. I mean, that puts the company in kind of a dangerous situation, and requires them to kind of make some sort of statement, really, to kind of reduce the chance of directors getting really low voting results. Another, similarly, actually, we looked at compensation-related reasons. Just the last category I'll mention is for directors who got ISS negative recommendations for compensation-related reasons. First of all, most situations in which that happened is where the company didn't have a say-on-pay vote that year. And so under ISS policies, the say-on-pay vote kind of serves as a buffer. If there's a compensation-related problem, ISS will direct it to the say-on-pay vote in most cases. So it was really for companies that are on a 2-year or a 3-year cycle, they'll direct those concerns to withhold votes on the comp committee. The other type of compensation-related negative recommendation that was really impactful is where the company received less than 70% on a prior year's say-on-pay and was not seen by ISS as having done sufficient shareholder outreach or making sufficient changes to be seen as responsive to those concerns. So that's really, the average shareholder vote in those cases was around 54%. So that's another instance of non-responsiveness, and it shows that shareholders more broadly, not just ISS and Glass Lewis, but shareholders more broadly are very focused on not kind of those footfall type issues, but those types of responsiveness to shareholder concerns.
Glenn, we only have about a minute left here, but tell me what boards should be doing to make their particularly their outside directors, but all their board members sort of less of a target in this new environment.
Right. I mean, some are, some are easy. We didn't talk about, more of the footfall ones are not attending 75% of board meetings or overboarding, and those are things that companies track and that, generally you can avoid with attention. The shareholder responsiveness one is difficult. I mean, when you're in that situation, it's difficult because the board has a fiduciary obligation to do what they think is best for the company. Not with even if that is in the face of a shareholder approved proposal, the board still has an obligation to set up the governance structures that in their particular circumstances they think are best. It puts you in a difficult circumstances where you're going to face withhold votes and potentially get kicked out of office in one way or another if you're going to do that. I think what's helpful in some way is that for companies that are in that position where it's one of the ones that are really impactful, like non-responsiveness, that's really kind of the end point of a multi-year process that started with a shareholder proposal. And that is, there are a number of points during that process where you can take action, whether it's replacing the shareholder proposal with the company's own, slightly modified proposal, whether it's reaching out to shareholders during the whole course of this to explain the company's position. It's generally not something that's going to have snuck up on a company. So I think like in almost everything we talk about this proxy season, last proxy season, comes back to shareholder outreach and understanding and anticipating shareholder concerns and responding to it either by taking responsive action or by explaining to your shareholders why in your particular situation, the board has made the decisions they've made.
Well, it is the year of shareholder engagement, that's for sure. And we used to preach just do the right thing. And today we preach do the right thing, but be aware of the shareholders' issues.
Right, do the right thing and explain it well.
Right,
Yeah.
because shareholders have rights, board has rights, but you don't want to get to the legal part of that. You want to have a good understanding. So, well, how would somebody go about getting a copy or having a chance to look at this? Is it on your site?
Yes, so if people go to sulcrom.com, then it's on our website, or anyone can contact me with any questions, and we can send them a copy. But yeah, it's one of our publications. It's on our website.
So that's
sullcrom.com.
Okay, and we'll ask for a copy of that, and we'll get it on the boardmember.com site as well. That way people can have good access to that, if that's okay.
Terrific.
And Glenn, thank you. This is, again, we only touched a little bit on what's in the report.
Right.
In fact, just a fraction, but I think people will find that interesting, and I'm glad that you were able to have the time to come join us.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
I have a couple of things just to pass along to the audience before we depart. First of all, probably cyber security and cyber risk is one of the key issues, and certainly all our research shows that corporate board member and the NYSE Governance Services will be holding its Board IT Challenge, which is the second year that we're doing that, to help directors understand how the right questions to ask their management team about making sure that they are on top of this difficult topic of cyber risk. It's going to be September 16th in Atlanta. Again, you can get the information on our website. Also, I want to make everybody aware is our annual Boardroom Summit. It will be held on October 3rd and 4th with the infamous board chair peer exchange the day before on October 2nd. It's probably one of the best things we do. And if you haven't participated in that, if you talk to somebody that has, you'll find out that there isn't any better way to spend your day as a board chair of any committee than at the peer exchange. So with that will conclude this week's This Week in the Boardroom, and we hope you'll join us next week where we'll take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member and committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.